Welcome to Dirtyberg, where training is continuous. I'm JT, and this is our first EKG Chuck Talk. Today we're going to quickly discuss the basics of what an EKG is. EKG stands for electrocardiography. When we break that down, we have the electricity in the heart represented in graph form. This is all completed from our EKG monitor. Now let's start with the monitor. The monitor is basically a voltmeter, just like one you would use for testing a battery. Our voltmeter will have electrodes that are letting us know whether we were receiving positive or negative current, as well as the time it takes for this process to occur. Now, instead of right or left equaling a positive reading, we'll say our needle is on its side, with right or up giving me a positive deflection, and left or down giving me a negative deflection. So our voltmeter, or our EKG monitor, has a printer assembly and electrodes, and is going to create a graph over time representing this electricity. That's all its job is. Now let's add in our heart, because this is the battery our voltmeter is testing. Let's take a chunk out of it for a good example. This slab of meat right here, this piece of myocardium, is made up of many cells, obviously. Now let's take a closer look at this row of cells to talk about action potential. Don't worry, it's not very complicated. Action potential is just the process of depolarization and repolarization, or an easy way to think of it mechanically is muscle contraction and relaxation. I know sometimes the vernacular in medicine is what causes confusion because at first, med terminology is like studying a new language. But we'll cover this more in future episodes. We just want to lay a good, simple foundation to work from. So, if we have these cells, and I stimulate one of these cells with a cation, or electricity, I'm going to cause a reaction. That reaction involves some ions and these channels that the ions utilize to move in and out of the cells. These cells from our ventricle will sit at about negative 90 millivolts when they are resting, when nothing is going on in the cell. The number itself isn't important. When I have the action on the cell, the cation entering, which are positive ions, I'm going to increase the voltage within the cell. This is the act of depolarization beginning. Once I get to a certain value, we'll say around negative 40 millivolts, another reaction occurs within the cell that opens up some of the gates for sodium ions. Now there are much more sodium ions outside of the resting cell than inside. So in order to equalize, they're going to rush in the cell. Well, again, since they're positively charged ions, we're increasing the positive charge within the cell and thus increasing the voltage within the cell. So it continues to rise until we get completely depolarized. We'll say around positive 30 millivolts, which causes a reaction for potassium gates to open. Now, just like there were more sodium ions outside of the cell versus inside, we have an imbalance with potassium, but it's inverse. So we have more potassium inside than outside at rest. Potassium will leak out, causing this little blip here. We soon have calcium come into play through their channels, and with the influx of calcium and efflux of potassium, it kind of equalizes and we have a plateau period. Eventually, calcium is going to cease and potassium will exit until we reach back at our baseline of negative 90 millivolts, give or take. When we look at this in front of an EKG tracing, we'll call this lead C1 for cell 1. We see what kind of looks like what we see on EKG leads. Time and upward and downward deflection. And this process continues because these neighboring cells have what we call gap junctions. Basically little doorways where the cations that were just depolarizing the cell to the left can enter to the cell to the right and start the whole process over just like a daisy chain. If I had this myocardium here with a negative lead on one side and positive on the other, and my voltmeter was reading this, it would draw positive deflections as the wave of electricity travels left to right towards the positive lead here. And it would go back to baseline during repolarization. Now, one thing to add is that once all of these cells depolarize and become positive, the process of repolarization is going to begin with the last cells to depolarize. So it's going to start this repolarization process in the opposite direction of when the myocardium depolarized. So we'd have a negative current going towards a negative lead, which if we remember math class, we're going to see a positive deflection. By the way, this is actually why our T waves, which are representations of ventricular repolarization, are normally upright or positive, just like the R wave that represents ventricular depolarization. So to break this down easily, cation influx causes increase in voltage, travels through gap junctions from cell to cell across the myocardium, and the EKG reads the mean vector, or the direction of current from most of the cells, and will represent the deflections on paper. We will be building on this down the road. Hopefully this helped you visualize what's actually happening from cell to ink. And in next week's Chalk Talk, we'll be going over the first wave in our EKG. Usually the first wave, the P wave.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.